Teaching the young does not mean risking our future. Because universal primary education does precisely that for developing countries, we believe it is a misallocation of resources there. But let's first ask what primary education is. We are referring to the first stage of formal education that children engage in at public or private schools to gain basic literacy or numeracy. What then is universal primary education? Let's be clear here. Universal primary education means governments have to provide primary education at the same standard for every child everywhere. It is the second Millennium Development Goal promulgated by the United Nations in 2000, but let's remember it is only one of the many priorities faced by developing countries and must thus be weighed against such goals as industrialization and providing good healthcare. What are we referring to by the developing world? We're talking about countries that are at a low base of economic empowerment. They typically have low standards of living and are often seriously indebted. In Tanzania today, the government continues to spend a third of its budget on debt repayments alone, and over 30% of the population still lives below the World Bank poverty line of $1.25 a day. Most developing countries continue to rely on agriculture and extracting natural resources for growth. Yet these sectors are often subject to volatile prices and climate change, hindering their ability to support economic uplift. Even today, sub-Saharan African nations are still recovering from the 1990s when their economies contracted by up to 1.1% every year. What do we stand for on the side of proposition? We stand for a broad toolbox of measures that are now employed to tackle such problems as poverty, disease, and malnutrition. We're talking about measures that include, but are not limited to, more efficient farming practices, the construction of healthcare infrastructure, and the distribution of anti-malaria vaccines. What does it precisely mean then to say that universal primary education is a misallocation of resources? We say trying to achieve it runs counter to two aims in the developing world. First, short-term survival. Second, sustainable long-term development. We're going to prove this through three lines of argument. First, that it's an affront to the lives of the suffering. Second, it hinders progress in the developing world. And lastly, my second speaker will argue that there are systemic inefficiencies with universal primary education. So let's look at our first argument as to why it's an affront to the lives of the suffering. Here, our thesis is that universal primary education is a misallocation of resources in developing countries which remain unable to provide for the basic necessities of life. We recognize human rights are crucial because they uphold our dignity. Among all rights, however, the right to life is the most important. Without the right to life, you can't use any of your other rights because you're dead. While universal primary education is a noble goal, it does nothing to protect the right to life in the most downtrodden countries of the world. According to the United Nations Development Programme, 80% of people who die from malaria today are African children because their governments didn't have the money to provide them the anti-malaria vaccines and bed nets they needed. But you disagree.
Sir, couldn't primary education provide a huge wealth of knowledge about these diseases which could greatly improve the chances of survival in these countries?
Primary education might do this, but we think we can provide such education directly to villagers through programs that are already in place by the United Nations, by the development programs run by the World Health Organization. We don't see how universal primary education is needed for this. We challenge your next speaker to explain why. So let's move back to my case. And again, we see this in Haiti. For every 100,000 childbirths in 2011, 670 women died. Contrast this with the United States, where that number was 11. In such dire circumstances, every dollar no thank you that goes to universal primary education means a dollar less that goes to saving the lives of people in developing countries. No thank you. In fact, pursuing universal primary education in the developing world, no thank you, does education an injustice. Why? For universal primary education to succeed, we must first ensure children can learn well and attend school consistently. But in sub-Saharan Africa, only half of the children finish primary education because many of them die of tropical diseases before that. Furthermore, many children drop out of primary school to help their families who are barely living at subsistence level, usually as smallholder farmers. Hence, in Malawi, over 15% of girls and, no thank you, 12% of boys have dropped out of primary school, despite government efforts to make primary education free as part of universal primary education. Because the funds devoted to universal primary education could have saved millions of sick and starving people in developing countries today, we say it is an affront to the lives of the suffering. Before I move to my next point, yes.
Sir, aren't you aware that it isn't just a zero-sum game? The money we spend on primary education can mean that we can more efficiently spend money on healthcare, which allows us to spend more on both and gain better results.
We agree primary education and healthcare are good things for governments to spend on. We just don't see how your side has shown that universal primary education is the right way to go. We challenge your speakers to explain this argument. Again, let's move back to my case, where we talk about hindering progress in developing countries. The thrust of our argument is that pursuing universal primary education jeopardizes long-term economic and educational improvement in developing countries. Here, we're going to say improving the quality of life in developing countries needs increased economic growth. Today, economic growth in developing countries is led by agriculture and industry. But for these sectors to grow, universal primary education is not fundamentally important. Even in the United States today, 20% of industrial workers are functionally illiterate. They can't read the instructions needed to operate their machinery, but have learned to do so through on-the-job training. Even where entrepreneurship is concerned, universal primary education is not crucial because illiterate individuals can use microcredit to establish businesses while learning skills like stock taking on the job. This explains the stellar success of the Grameen Bank in the Indian state of Bihar, where what happens is 36.2% of its customers are illiterate, but the Grameen Bank has sustained repayment rates in excess of 95%. No thank you. By pursuing universal primary education, however, governments in developing countries sacrifice long-term progress. This is because of the huge financial burden that universal primary education places on governments in developing countries. Today, 83% of Indian children have access to primary education, but for the country to raise enrollment rates up to 95%, which is part and parcel of universal primary education, the government is going to fork out an additional $10 billion US, which is 50% more than the entire budget set for 2010 for education. But if the developing world chose to focus on promoting its competitive advantages, we support long-term primary education in terms of its expansion. Why? With more income, you grow better, your families are on a more stable financial footing, people drop out less. Furthermore, tax revenues increase as national incomes go up. And it's only then that governments can finally have the budgets they need to provide good schools and good education. Because we stand for saving lives today and promoting education where it is best, it is a side proposition that truly cares.
I think the first proposition speaker is
not yet. Wait, yeah, you know, we're going to do our notes and then yeah.
And now to open the case for the opposition, I call upon...
Should I say it again?
Yes.
Yours, Brooders. Ladies and gentlemen, our proposition wants to keep the developing countries on life support. They stand for keeping them on life support, making sure that they are reliant on our help continuously. Then they say we also want to invest in microfinance, and I will explain why that won't work. But they have told us they want to give vaccines to this world, they want to invest in basic healthcare. We say, first of all, vaccines are much more expensive than primary education is at all. Primary education for a child is estimated at $100. For instance, vaccines are far more expensive, plus you need way many more. Plus, the fact, which is a great problem which they have not addressed at all, is that a great many resources are squandered in the developing world because of a lack of knowledge. For instance, AIDS medicine in the first stage cost $8,000, in the later stage $20,000. Now this could be averted, this could be avoided by the simple use of condoms, which only cost a few dollars. But then these people need to know how to use a condom. We say that the problem in these worlds is not the fact that they don't have any food at all. The problem in the developing worlds is often the fact that people do have some resources, they are busy farming, they are busy trying to do something, but we say what really helps them is to be better at what they are doing right now, to improve on that, and we say that universal primary education is a unique, cost-efficient, and very effective tool for that, and this is also our team line. So first of all, our rebuttal. Well, I've already talked about the measures that they want to take. First of all, they're very expensive. It is not as if when you have $1 that you don't spend on primary education, that you suddenly can spend it on something else, which we'll also come to. They've talked about shortened survival. First, we need to make sure that they have food. We say Maslow is a very short-sighted analysis in this case. This is also about the development of the country. We can't just keep them reliant. For instance, it might be very smart if somebody is hungry to buy him a bread in the short term, but we can't keep on buying bread for him for the rest of his life. That is penny smart, pound foolish. That's the point here. So they say they also want communal programs. And to that I would like to say, communal programs will never have the same authority as primal education. Because we are also going to explain that once you have universal primary education in certain areas, you have the authority of the local people. For instance, a woman who would simply come to a village to talk about sex, something which is a taboo in the first place, wouldn't be listened to because she's just some random woman who is coming to you. She starts talking about the most intimate things. You wouldn't listen at all to her, whereas primary education gives you authority. Now why? We say that the model of the United Nations is the best way. We say that the United Nations support the governments with monetary funds and with expertise, and in that case they allow the government to build a curriculum. So the government is responsible for the curriculum that is part of this country. Now how does this work further? If primary education needs to be institutionalized in a region, what they do is they take people from that region, bring them to the government, train them as teachers, and then send them back to this region. Now why is this so effective? This means that we will have teachers who first of all come from the region, know the specific problems that are part of this region, please sit down, and that means that that will make it much easier for them to actually have an effect in that region, because those people know the problems, and the people that get lessons from them know these people, know that they speak the language. This is all very handy. And this could also mean, for instance, that in an area where you are suffering more from malaria because the area is more swamp-like, that you could spend more time in your curriculum, on curing malaria instead of, for instance, spending time on how to have safe sex. So we say that teachers can custom tailor their primary education to the areas where it is needed, and therefore, that is also one of our points. We say that universal primary education through this means that it is most effective where it comes to. So then they've talked to you about how it hinders programs. They want you to believe that every dollar you spend on primary education, please sit down, that you cannot spend on something else. But we say often medicine is squandered because of lack of knowledge. And a good example of this would, for instance, be that people have been wearing condoms as amulets for a long time now in Africa. Why? Because they do not know how it works. So you could throw 100,000 condoms at them, but they simply will not use it. So we say that if you had a budget of $20 and $10 you would spend on primary education, they want you to believe that you then would have to take away money from primary education to spend it on something else. But we say, if you spend money on primary education, we can more effectively spend on other things, and we can more effectively spend on healthcare, we can more effectively spend on other programs which you are so for. Yes, you may now make a point.
So if your primary concern is improving healthcare standards, wouldn't it be better to get healthcare professionals teach people about it rather than education?
Well, I'm just coming to that. Healthcare is just one of the many benefits that primary education gives you. Primary education teaches a myriad of skills. Not only gives it great health benefits, but it also gives a lot of other things which I'm going to talk about. So, our first argument will be about improving daily life. Our second argument will be about the next step. And our third argument will be, we'll talk about how primary education is such a successful tool and how it works with bringing across the knowledge. So first of all, improving daily life. We say that one of the most important problems is the fact that people have resources, they do know a bit, but they do not know enough. And we say that with primary education, with simple skills such as reading and counting, you could greatly improve what you're already doing. For instance, we could teach these children about effective agriculture. And a nice example of this is saltinization. The fact that if you throw lots of water on the land, the minerals in that water, the water will evaporate, the minerals will stay. Now if you do not know this, it would make perfect sense to throw lots of water on plants, because that's what makes them grow, right? But in the long term, that means that you are destroying your farmlands, and the only way to teach them about this is to have a local authority which knows about these problems in the region, and have this local authority teach people about these things. So we say that, for instance, you might build a clean well, but that clean well has no use whatsoever if people do not know how to keep that water clean. For instance, they could go to that well once a week and get lots of water. If they then put that bucket outside of their door, parasites will still get into that water and they'll still be unhealthy. If people still don't know how to have proper hygiene, then still giving them all this clean water doesn't help, because if they don't have hygiene, they'll contract it simply from something else. And we say that primary education teaches a myriad of skills, which is also why we need so long for it. Because they might rightfully ask, why would you then need 6 years? Why don't we just set up 100,000 random programs that will teach them these things? Well, first of all, primary education is a place of learning. It's where we come together, it's where we can get lots of skills at the same time from the same teachers. Second of all, it is very unhandy to, for each problem, get a new teacher, set up a new project, if you can simply do it more effectively through primary education. So, ladies and gentlemen, we say that primary education allows you to be better at life. And a good example nationwide of this is that it's the children of mothers who have gone to primary education, who have received that, have a 40% less mortality rate in infants in the first 5 years of their life. That's huge. That's 40% more children who survive. This also means that the mothers who now have to give birth to less babies can focus more on other things in life, which we think is very good. So, our second point is the next step. And we say that in this case, we say that first of all, primary education already does lots of these very good things. But we say that primary education is also unique in the fact that it prepares you for the next step, namely the following. The next step works in 3 steps. First of all, it is the knowledge that there is a next step. Rudimentary knowledge of geography will tell you that there is a village beyond. It will tell you that there are people with jobs and people who have other jobs. Second of all, people who will offer you these jobs will now know that there are people with this basic knowledge in this country, and that means that people can now work together. So several farmers will know that there are other farmers, so they can set up communal farms, and they can all do a simple task in that farm. They can all specialize in that task within their farm. And we say that once that match is made, you are far better able to spread the knowledge and to spend that knowledge, because you are able to read, because you can read manuals. And we say that this is a very good thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, because they want you to believe that primary education is a misallocation, and we say we disagree, we say vote opposition.
And I thank the first opposition speaker for his speech. And now to continue the case for the proposition, I call upon
I can't tell you how much I would love to live in the world of opposition. Because it's a very nice sort of world. It's a world where there is barely any corruption, where there's barely any systemic healthcare problem, and where the resources of governments multiply to meet their needs. Unfortunately, we don't live in that sort of a world. And that's why I have 3 simple points of contention. Firstly, are our measures effective? A fairly small point. Secondly, is education in their model really necessary? And last of all, is their method of instituting this universal primary education even going to work in the first place? But before I move on, I'd like to point out that a very important bit of analysis Ben brought up about why you need other prerequisites to be in place before universal primary education can work was left completely untouched by that side of the house. Ben told you why you need for them to have good health before this education can even work. Because no one's going to go to your schools if they're staying at home sick. We need to hear a response to that. First point of contention then, are our measures effective? They say, for example, that our vaccines are extremely expensive and that compared to that universal primary education is very cheap. Firstly, a lot of Ben's analysis went to demonstrating to you empirically why universal primary education is a huge demand on government budgets, and governments simply can't afford this in many cases. They never dealt with that. Furthermore, we tell you that no thank you, vaccines are actually extremely cheap compared to universal primary education. You can buy 4 malaria vaccines for $2 US, and you only need to give it to them once in their entire lives. Unlike universal primary education, which needs to be a consistent policy applied over a long period of time, up to 6 years in many jurisdictions. So we think we do have a huge advantage, no thank you, in terms of efficiency. Then they say you need this to teach them about condoms and healthcare because they're wearing it as in inappropriate manners. We tell you, well, there are many solutions to that. Part of it is to get the WHO to come down and demonstrate to them, not physically of course, how condoms are used. No thank you. That's what the WHO does in the present, and governments don't do it because the budgetary constraints are just too large. No thank you. Last of all is the accusation that we're placing these countries on infinitely long life support. No, we are not. We're telling these countries the more urgent problems, you can solve these problems right now, and then you may want to think about universal primary education in the future. So we're not putting them on some kind of leash and holding them back. We're letting them step onto this level of development, no thank you, in the future. Second point of contention, therefore, is this necessary? They first say that it is necessary to educate them about healthcare. I'd like to point out, first of all, that's a rather odd kind of universal primary education, because primary education includes many more things than just teaching them how to use a condom or that they are parasites in the water. It means you need to have teachers who know basic numeracy and literacy skills and are able to convey these effectively in a pedagogical method which is sound to the students. So it's not just as narrow as you make it out to be. But even if we do want to focus on these things, we tell you, as I've mentioned already, many other institutions around the world focus on sending healthcare professionals and agricultural experts to tell these people what they should be doing. But before I move on, yes?
How can you set up a successful microfinance business if you can't count, can't read, and can't talk with anyone beyond your village?
But you don't need to go to a school in order to count. Many people learn how to count and learn how to loan and gain microfinance from their own personal experience. It's not necessary to go to a school to learn these sorts of basic skills. That's what Benjamin told you again. That's what your first speaker completely failed to deal with. So we tell you, and in many cases, the sort of healthcare problems you're talking about, like parasites in the water, can't be solved by education. Because the problem in that case is that the government can't provide clean water in the very first place. So a far more efficient solution is not just to tell these guys that they're parasites in your water, but to get rid of them altogether. To build a pipeline that carries clean water, or give them chemicals to get rid of these, no thank you, of these parasites in the water. So we tell you that's not an efficient solution either. Then they last of all made this very small point at the end about how no one knows anyone else exists, so we need to educate them so they can come into communities. That's not true. In many developing countries, communities are already extremely tight-knit, and they often come together in many cases. That's what the Grameen Bank exists purely for illiterate majority. So we tell you that's not the case either. Let me move on now to my point of substantive, about why we think that universal primary education is a systemically inefficient and therefore an unrealistic and a pointless goal. And very nicely, I'm going to be embedding my rebuttal about why the method of instituting universal primary education is not going to work into my substantive as well. So listen out for that. I'm going to talk about the problems of universal primary education in three main areas: in the domains of governance, the learning environment, and manpower. Let's first look at the first domain of problems. We tell you endemic corruption in the developing world is particularly bad in the realm of universal primary education, because as they themselves pointed out, it requires that precious government money, which is very scarce already, is dispersed in areas with the poorest amount of existing oversight and every convention, no thank you, for large amounts of corruption. In Pakistan, 25,000 schools are officially registered that don't actually exist. The so-called teachers there still get paid, and all the bright government officials say that these are fully functional. No thank you. In Indonesia, in the vast majority of rural schools, it was discovered just earlier this year that teachers were forcing students to cheat in national examinations so that they could report higher scores to the Ministry of Education. This is all the sort of corruption that's going to accrue in that case, where they bring teachers up from these rural areas, train them, and then send them back there without any sort of oversight whatsoever. But even if you made a fairly generous assumption that these schools actually exist, we still tell you universal primary education is likely not to work. This brings me on to my second area where the problems occur, those of the learning environment. The average that these low-income countries are able to spend per child per year amounts to about 4 cents a week. What does that actually buy you? It buys you 60 students crammed into a dingy and probably structurally unsound classroom taught by a teacher who probably doesn't even know what they're talking about. We pointed to the fact that in Uganda, the student-teacher ratio is 110 to 1. Those are not the sort of circumstances under which efficient and effective teaching can take place. I'll take you in a moment. Furthermore, many of these governments and schools and teachers have neither the textbooks nor the assessment materials to effectively teach, and after that to evaluate the abilities of their students. But before I move on, yes?
Sir, the fact that you say that the governments don't have the money and are very corrupt, but doesn't that affect you as well? Simply the fact that primary education is not perfect doesn't mean you can suddenly go all over and buy something else, because the same problems of monetary problems affect you as well.
Yes, they affect us. So it may be possible that many of our solutions aren't perfect as well, but that means that your model of universal primary education is certainly flawed. But we say that in our case, monitoring is a lot more easy, because as we said, most of these activities are monitored and carried out by international organizations who come in and help out. No such thing occurs for universal primary education. Let's move on therefore to my last area where problems occur, and that's the problem of manpower. Unfortunately, teachers are extremely scarce in such country, and the skills they need are even more scarce. We pointed to the fact that in 7 sub-Saharan nations that adopted the universal primary education framework, 6-year-olds regularly outperform their own teachers in basic literacy and numeracy tests. Now, I'm all for students outperforming teachers, but if they're 6 years old, allow me to suggest that something has gone quite seriously wrong. There's no accountability, there's no effectiveness, and there's no way to control what happens in that case. We are very proud to stand today in proposition.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech.
what I like about the case of Team Singapore today is that one of the first things they said in their first speech was that they want to educate people. They said, let's educate them with healthcare professionals, with farming practices, and basically everything that UPE does. Given that Team Singapore has therefore conceded that this knowledge is necessary, if Team Opposition can prove that UPE is the most efficient way to do so, we have won this debate on Team Singapore's terms. And, coincidence, coincidence, all my constructive will be about why universal primary education is the most efficient means to do this. Therefore, this will clash with all their material on why consults from healthcare professionals would be more efficient than having a school with a dedicated teacher who has authority. But before I get to my constructive, of course, I'd like to rebut some. Firstly, the idea that education is an affront to people, right? UPE, they quote, say, does nothing to save lives, even though we pointed out that children of mothers who received education had a 40% less chance of dying before the age of 5. It is simple fact that education saves lives. Their model is an either-or model. Either you buy vaccines, or you buy the knowledge how to use them. As Jules already pointed out and hasn't been fully responded to, is the idea that if you invest in the knowledge, you can more efficiently use the materials you have. So, to go with the metaphor of Team Opposition, of Team Singapore, we would rather invest in the knowledge and less vaccines, so we can ensure that all the vaccines are used properly, instead of just buying tons of vaccines with the risk, for example, of needle infections, which are actually a huge problem with malaria vaccinations, because people simply don't know that you need to use clean needles. No, thank you. Then they gave an example about lots of diseases and how it's really easily prevented. Well, we talked about HIV. We told them that HIV and sex is a huge taboo within communities, and that just a random white healthcare professional walking into a village and challenging the common wisdom of the village elder will probably not convince anyone of actually using the condom. And the UN estimates that we can prevent 7 million cases of AIDS in the coming years by doing universal primary education. This is not only a human tragedy which we prevent, but it is also a huge economic boon, to talk in the economic terms of Team Singapore, because the drugs for AIDS cost $8,000 a year. So educating a whole class of kids, and if you prevent one kid from getting AIDS, you are already making a net profit economically. And please sit down. Okay, then they took some of the worst examples of UPE, 60 children in a classroom, 30% drops out, children reading, which is obviously something very bad, even reading better than their teachers, boo boo boo. Yes, it is imperfect. So are your solutions. These are developing countries. There will be no perfect system to address all problems at the same time. But when you talk about 30% dropout, we see 70% of kids getting educated. When you say that there are 60 kids in the classroom not getting individual attention, we say that they are getting some attention, getting at least taught the basic skills. All right. And that brings me to my constructive. So, as I told you, if we can prove that universal primary education is the most efficient means, we win this debate. Sir?
How is it effective to teach 11-year-olds how to use condoms?
Well, they remember, and when they have sex, they use them, and therefore do not get HIV. It's pretty simple. All right. Transfer of knowledge. My constructive, in which will prove that UPE is the most effective medium to transfer knowledge and put that knowledge into action. So, firstly, we have schools all around the world, and this isn't a coincidence. It's because schools are very, very good at what they do. They're the most efficient means to diffuse information over a large amount of people at a very young age. So the first thing that works about a school is pure logistics. That you have get people together. You have a building on hand. You have systematic logistics of getting everyone into the building at the same time and having a person there to educate them. It's simple logistics. All the separate classes that Team Singapore wants to teach about all the different things can simply be taught very efficiently by one teacher who has had the essential education by the government as it works today. So, Also, you have like things like chairs there, books, boards, just the basic essentials you have there already. Huge logistical improvement over just setting up every random class when you want to.
Point.
Secondly, it's a controlled environment. Over the 6 years that you get an education, you get all kinds of feedback loops working. For example, the knowledge is not only given, but is internalized by having tests every year that make you remember what you had to do. And because you keep remembering and keep repeating it for yourself, you ingrain it within your brain, and therefore you probably make it a habit. And if you keep repeating it, which is not the case with the communal classes that Team Singapore wants to teach, you have a far more likely chance of putting the knowledge into making it a habit, and therefore putting the knowledge into action within the community. A third essential point about this is teacher authority. You also already analyzed why the teachers come from the region where the lessons are given. Well, that's why they have a simple respect, because they are people from the region, people know them, they are part of the community. And second, we see that a teacher is acknowledged by the whole community as a person of authority, as a person who has gotten an education and is therefore extremely important to the community as a whole, as a person who saves lives. A random medical professional, a white guy walking into a village that is all black, will probably get rejected just because he is some random guy. And fourthly, we see that it's not only practical skills that become habits, but it's also behavior. And this is totally passed by Team Singapore's model of nice random classes, because sitting with kids together every day, learning to work together, to communicate with each other, to talk to each other, is essential for your later behavior. You are conditioned to become a civilized human being who can easily work together with others to, for example, form enterprises. So that's why UPE is so much more efficient. And there's even more, namely the multiplier effect, as UNICEF coined it, which is totally unique for UPE. Firstly, the multiplier works for demography, because we see that there's a huge population growth, often within the countrysides of very poor nations, and every kid that gets born demands extra resources. So the current shortages of resources that Singapore is so sad about get worsened. And girls, firstly, learn to use contraception, secondly, learn to stand up for themselves because they are equal to boys, because they are entitled to the same education as boys, and thirdly, they learn how to make their kids healthy. So you take away a fundamental cause of why women get so much children today, which is because they're not sure they can raise their child to grow up, so they need to get lots of them just to be sure they have 3 in the end of their life. By teaching them how to take care of their kids, you are ensuring that they get less kids. So we see that there is a huge demographic multiplier at work, which saves the country from explosive population growth. So what have I proven today? I've given you 4 reasons why UPE works so much better than the random communal classes Singapore wants to teach and is deemed essential for the community. And therefore, we have given you the best means of educating the community, and therefore, we take this debate.
I thank the second opposition speaker for his And now to continue the case for the proposition, I call upon Jules
I'm going to look at 3 issues in this speech. First, what is UPE really like in the real world? Next, we're going to look at why our policy is better for developing countries now. Finally, I'm going to look at why our policy is better for developing countries in the future. Let's go on to my first point. What is UPE really like in the real world? Now guys, I don't know what the primary schools in Holland are like, but I assume they must be really, really awesome. Because the things Team Holland have been telling us are taught in primary schools don't sound anything like the sort of things I learned when I was 6 years old. They say, in primary school, you learn how to grow crops better. No, I didn't. I was busy learning 1 + 1 = 2. They say in primary schools, you learn how to look after your children better. No, I didn't, because, kids in primary school tend not to have children. Finally, they say in primary school, we learn how not to have sex and use protection. Maybe it's just Team Singapore here, but we don't think that 11-year-olds are the group in society at most risk from having sex and getting AIDS. Maybe it's just us here, but we don't think this is what UPE is meant to do. Universal primary education doesn't teach you all these things. Trained healthcare professionals teaching 15, 16, 17-year-olds or adults teach you these things. Universal primary education, no thank you, focuses on young children, teaching them basic skills. So all Team Holland's arguments about somehow agriculture is going to be improved, healthcare is going to be improved, child rearing is going to be improved, doesn't make sense. Because the people you're teaching under primary education don't tend to be the people growing the crops, raising the children, or having sex. No, I'll take both of you later. So let's keep that in mind. This is what universal primary education really is like. But we took this one step further. We showed you what universal primary education was like in the developing world. Now, Team Holland came up trying to poo-poo this. They said, oh, we've only given you the worst examples. Really? We've given you a long, entire train of examples from countries as diverse as India and Tanzania, all of which are uniformly negative. We've given you a track record of failure. Failure because corruption in these places is endemic, and Team Holland hasn't given us a single example, positive example, no thank you sir, of good universal primary education. Universal primary education in the developing world is always corrupt. I'll be telling you more why now in my second point of contention. Why is our policy better now? The first reason why our policy is better now is because we're better able to solve the problem of corruption. Team Holland tried to rebut this in a point of information, mind you, when they came up and told us, well, corruption's just as bad on your side of the house as it is on ours. No, it isn't. It's a lot easier to tell that a road is there than to tell that the teacher in every single classroom around your country is teaching your students well. I mean, for development projects and for vaccination projects, all you have to do is go there for a few days in the year to see that the program is carried out carefully and properly. Team Holland want to place monitors in every single classroom for the whole year round. That clearly isn't feasible. In any case, Ashish has given you a huge track record of failure which they failed to rebut. The next reason why our policy is better now is that we end up saving lives. Team Holland has this strange argument that, it's not a zero-sum game when we're talking about the government budget. Guys as Greece, Italy, and Spain have found out to their cost, we are talking about a zero-sum game here. Now, we're not really good at a lot of things in Singapore, but we are really good at math. And we tell you that if you have $100 with you, and you take $1 to pay for UPE, that's $99 you have left to spend on other things. Then they have this strange argument about how UPE makes everything more effective in the long run. First of all, we'd like to point out what we said in Benjamin, that it doesn't really matter in the long run if all the people you're trying to save, if you wait a while, die now because of malnutrition. And secondly, all because people are educated doesn't suddenly mean you need less vaccines. You're still going to need 100 vaccines to vaccinate 100 people, whether they know basic numeracy or basic literacy at all. Yes, sir?
Do you realize that when you learn a kid how to grow a crop when he's a kid, he will actually remember when he becomes a farmer, when he grows up?
First of all, there's a vast gap between the time your kid leaves primary school and, takes up farming. Secondly, I just don't remember learning how to grow a crop in my primary school class. And that's not what they teach you in primary school. That's what they teach you in agricultural programs, no thank you sir, food science programs, which are taught in the sort of secondary and tertiary institutions we have been supporting. But here's a very damning point in Team Holland's case, and we've said this from the beginning of the debate, that universal primary education can't work without a whole host of other programs. It's very telling that the first step in Team Holland's program is to educate teachers. Where are they going to educate the teachers? In tertiary institutions? Because I tell you, these countries don't even have tertiary institutions in the first place. We want to put more tertiary institutions first before we create more primary schools. Are you going to educate these teachers overseas? They can't speak the language. You need to teach them English. To teach them English, you need to educate the teachers first. That means building better teaching schools, better universities. This is what we stand for. So on this point about efficacy, Team Holland's case fails. No thank you, because they can't even prove to us that universal primary education works without the whole host of other policies we've talked about on our side of the house. Finally, they have this really, even if we accept all their argumentation above, we tell you there's one important Team Holland hasn't yet proven. They haven't yet proven why primary education must necessarily be universal. It might be a very good thing to teach primary education to the places where it's easy to reach, in the big cities, in the capitals of the nation. But is it justified to spend so much money going up to the furthest village or the furthest area of the country to teach a student a skill when that money could have been better spent educating 5, 10, 20 students in secondary schools within the big cities of our country? We don't think so. Benjamin told you that the costs of universal primary education exponentially expand with the example of India. Raising universal primary education from 85% to 95% costs double the entire education budget they have left. Countries just don't have the money to make sure that universal primary education really is universal, and even if they did, they could better spend it on other things. Let's go on to my final point of analysis now, why our case is better for countries in the future. We tell you our case is a lot better for countries in the future because we promote development. From the very beginning of this debate, we've told you that MNCs aren't going to your country because people can do algebra. They're going to your country because people make really good factory workers, screwing nuts and bolts on cars. And forgive me, but you don't really need to know algebra in order to do that. We've told you a way for the country to improve is to focus on technical skills, to focus on tertiary institutions, to focus on secondary schools, not universal primary education. So in the future, our country is a lot better. The only sort of rebuttal Team Holland had to this point was that if you don't have basic numeracy and basic literacy, you can't learn all of these skills. First of all, we never said we were against primary education. We were against the fact that it must be universal. It's okay to educate the people you're out of order, sir, in the cities that it's really easy to reach. Secondly, as we told you earlier, you can learn these skills through daily life. Talking to people, your mother can teach you how to speak properly without having to go to a primary school. Benjamin's point about the Grameen Bank showed you how people can learn basic numeracy in areas outside from the classroom. So because we give you more secondary and tertiary institutions and teach you the same primary skills anyway, our case is better in the future too. So because I've shown you that universal primary education really isn't what Team Holland think it is, that our case saves lives now and is better for countries' development in the future, go with Team Singapore.
Aside the third proposition speaker, please. And now to continue the case for the opposition, I call upon
and gentlemen, Madam Speaker, in the world of Team Singapore, there will never be a good approach towards all the problems that developing countries are facing today, because the goods will still not be used in a proper way, and there will never be long-term economic growth, because no company stays for a long time in a country for only cheap manual labor. Now, in my speech, I will be talking about three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about whether it is a first priority necessity that is solved by universal primary education. After that, I'm going to talk about practicalities and how universal primary education works. And finally, I'm going to talk about economic growth that UPE gives us, or whether we need cheap labor as Team Singapore seems to need. So first of all, whether we are solving a first priority necessity in this case. First of all, they said, well, only half of the children finish it, and many children don't go to school in the first place because they get ill. First of all, let's do a reality check and look at some real-world examples. For example, in the case of Tanzania, where we see that 95% of the children does go to primary education, and 60% finish it. No thanks, guys. And also, they seem to concede this point when they were talking about overcrowded classes, right? You don't have overcrowded classes if no one goes to school because they are all ill and sick. So in this case,
point of information, sir.
In reality, many children do go to these schools. No thanks. Then they said you need basic medicines and infrastructure first, because these are essential goods in the first place. We think that these basic goods are systematically misused and wasted without education, because these first priority preferences can never be effectively satisfied. Because to us it may seem self-evident that a wound infects if you don't clean it with water, and that water gets dirty if you keep it in a hot bucket for a week. However, for people who have never learned these kinds of things, it is not at all self-evident, and therefore it is very important that together with giving them these basic needs, it is also vital to also give some basic education on this. No thanks. And the strange thing is, after we gave this rebuttal on Team Singapore's point, they seem to suddenly concede it, therefore giving up their first argument, because they said, well, okay, we agree that skills are important. However, you just need to teach those skills with professionals, because there are all kinds of experts in the US that can teach this perfectly fine. No thanks. However, we think that primary education, universal primary education, is the most effective way to teach all these kinds of things. There are two important reasons for this. First of all, because universal primary education is over a longer time, and with young children, the behavior that you learn is internalized, because there is always a feedback loop with testing over a longer period. So all the kinds of behavior isn't simply taught one time, no thanks, and then forgotten after that, but it is internalized in your behavior for years. The second reason is that in the case of universal primary education, and I'll take you in a second, these things are taught by respected people. Because in the case of universal primary education, it is taught by locals that have been to universities in cities and then return to their own community, which is a system that is set up by the UN. And I'll take you now.
So you expect one teacher to be an expert in healthcare, sex education, and agricultural products. How does this even make any sense? Well,
of course we are talking about rather basic skills that have large effects, right? We're talking about how that you should clean a wound with water, because it would infect otherwise, and that you don't need to, that you shouldn't have salty water over your land, because in the long run that makes it that you can't use it anymore. And then they said, well, these are not the kinds of things that they teach at universal primary education. You learn some things like algebra. We think the great thing about universal primary education is that it is a strong focus. And the reason for that is that it is taught by these local people who come from these regions, but it's still about this kind of basic knowledge. So in these regions, these are absolutely the kind of things that will be taught, because these are the kinds of things that children should know from a young age. Therefore, this point stands on our side. Now, continuing to practicalities and whether it works. First of all, they said there is a lot of corruption. Well, let's keep in mind that this is inherent to countries and not at all to universal primary education. So that is something that any solution needs to deal with. And universal primary education, even if it's watered down, is still a lot better than any alternative solution, because that will also get watered down. Secondly, Madam Speaker, education is in the long run the most effective way to fight things such as corruption, because there is a basic understanding to get knowledge and a basic understanding of, for example, how a state works, and get educated. No thanks. So then they said these classes are overcrowded and there are no resources. Next to the fact that this is inconsistent with the fact that a lot of children wouldn't go to these places because they are ill, etc., we think there is still a lot of improvement in these cases. And there are also many cases where it is actually done, real-world examples, where it is actually done pretty well. So, so even things like a 30% dropout rate are still a 70% rate of people that do get educated. And finally, they said the teachers are incompetent. And we think also the great thing about universal primary education is that it is also a system to systematically train people to give these kinds of skills. Because the UN helps the governments to set up universities where locals learn these skills and then go back to their own community to teach these skills. So also to make sure that there are more competent people, we think universal primary education is an excellent way to systematically teach those kinds of skills. Now finally, Madam Speaker,
points of information.
No thanks. I will be talking about economic growth. Because the line that Team Singapore took in this debate was basically that economic growth is caused by agriculture and by simple industry and agriculture.
Point of information,
these are things that which do not necessarily need skills. And that companies go to these countries because of the availability of these simple skills. However, in cases where there is no universal primary education, they can only do this simple manual labor, which only can cause economic growth in the very short term. And we see all kinds of companies going from Cambodia to Thailand to Vietnam, etc. And there are two reasons for that. First of all, because the wages get gradually higher. Because when there are a lot of people doing manual labor, they will gradually get richer, and therefore they will need higher wages in the long run, because they demand more. Secondly, there is a lot of automatization going on, which means there is simply less need for these unskilled workers, because robots can do this work in the long term. However, contrary to countries such as Cambodia and Vietnam, etc., there is one country that did first install universal primary education, and that is China. And they managed to get they managed to have economic growth for 30 years. And the reason for that is that their employers are better able to adapt to new technologies, etc., that are needed, because they have simple simple skills such as reading a manual of how to operate a machine, right? Things that are not available in the countries of Team Singapore. And also we think the economics get a lot better through health. First of all, we think it is simple that because these products for health are used more effectively, there's more health and therefore simply more productivity because people are more fit. The second reason is that women need to get less children because many of their children die because of the high infant rate, which means that women are also easier empowered to have less children and work in a better way. So for all these reasons, Madam Speaker, we urge you to oppose this plan.
Moved to the Team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. The opposition team will deliver their reply speech first. There are no points of information during reply speeches. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know that they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice.
today, Team Singapore lived up to their reputation and gave excellent speeches and proved many points. However, they didn't quite prove the points that win in this debate. Because in their first speech, they already conceded that education and knowledge within communities is essential. They were the ones that started talking about farming and healthcare, and about long-term tools like numeracy and reading. The big clash in this debate then becomes, as this has been conceded by Team Singapore, what is the best way that we can teach people these skills? They gave their model of education, we gave ours. And that is the central clash of this debate. What model works best to teach these essential skills? So, first their model. The magic communal sessions which were never really explained. And that's really the big problem here. They really were never really explained how these communal sessions will be organized, how they will look, and why they will be effective. We, on the other hand, did analyze why they would not work. That if you just have a random white medical professional walking into a village, challenging the common wisdom of the village elder, he would probably not be accepted. But that you need an authority of a teacher from the community to do such things. Also, Team Singapore criticized us for doing expensive things, but failed to explain to us how medical professionals would be cheaper to send to all kinds of villages throughout Africa and other poor regions than simply educating one teacher that could teach all these basic skills. So their model of education hasn't been explained and is obviously more pricey than our education, so that the point of price falls on our side. And of course we talked about what universal primary education does do. Our model. In my speech, I gave you 4 reasons, which all have not been properly responded to, why universal primary education works. It's because of logistics. Because you have a school which has been put there, everybody shows up on time, you have a culture of getting knowledge. This has all been arranged by a school, which is very hard if you just want to set up a meeting every week with a different professional. Secondly, I talked about the feedback loops of tests. Why this ingrains knowledge into the brain, why then it then becomes a habit, and why then the knowledge will be put into action. Thirdly, we talked about teacher authority. This came in the first speech about why these teachers have unique authority, has not been responded to. And fourthly, we talked about how you condition behaviors. How these people will not only be taught basic things, but also really important communal things, like working together, communicating with each other. And the other really big benefit of UPE is that the things that we teach, like preventing infections, are benefits for everyone. So they asked, why would you teach everyone how to prevent infections and not get HIV? Because anyone who gets HIV will need really expensive treatments. Anyone who does not know how to treat his infections will die. So therefore, because these are huge costs in monetary capital and human capital, it is economically viable to teach everyone these basic skills. We also talked about the economy, about the demographics, how we will prevent the huge number of children that are born and demand resources. And Azer talked about how Singapore is dooming the future of the country to manual labor. It's something that is simply not sustainable, while he gave the example of China. That when you have basic skills to adapt to different industries, you have a far more far-reaching economic model than simply sticking to manual labor, which Team Singapore does. And then Team Singapore came with your gotcha point. Hey, if you learn something in primary education, you'll probably forget it by the age you're 20. Right, so we have primary education all over the world because kids forget everything the day they walk out of school. No, we have schools all over the world because schools work, because they are the most efficient means of diffusing essential information over the communities, and therefore we must give this tool to communities all around the world. Vote up.
now to conclude the case for the proposition in the debate as a whole, I call upon
As I get older, I often have to make decisions. Decisions involve sacrifices. It's not the best thing we can do, but it's the best thing forward for our future. So today's debate is about one of those. It's about deciding between the opposition, which has presented a sincere but misguided argument about primary education in general, and juxtapose it against a proposition which has chosen to be concerned about education, be concerned about development, but yet remain realistic about the limitations we face. We're going to show why our case prevailed through two questions. First, which side really keeps the developing world afloat? Second, which side truly builds their aspirations? So let's talk first about which side keeps the developing world afloat. What do we hear coming out of side opposition? We heard a plethora of new features which they wanted to introduce to universal primary education at the start. We heard about how we could learn agricultural skills, they will provide key information about the use of condoms and sexually transmitted diseases, all through primary education. But they never showed why it was going to be through the mechanism of universal primary education that this was going to work best. That's why we constantly presented them with more direct options, like the World Health Organization, like volunteer programs that already occur with a track record of success, which we sustained throughout the entire debate. And that's why they decided to retreat. What did they retreat to? Fictional constructs. They presented us this idealized image of a white guy stepping into a black village and essentially being a stranger. But we dispelled this image from the beginning because we talked about how we would be willing to network with local volunteers. We were willing to support the same kinds of education programs that are already occurring today in health, in agriculture, just not with universal primary education. And that was the point we did concede throughout the debate. So on this point, they decided to move away and talk about how alternatives might not exactly be as good with regard to vaccines, for example. When we pushed them with real statistics about such issues, all they chose to do was stray further from reality. They chose to talk about the systematic logistics that occur in primary schools. They talked about university-trained teachers. Point was, they dropped the ball by the end of their debate because their third speaker said, we need to build universities first before we can get everything else running. So quite clearly, the priority is no longer universal primary education on their side. And that's why all they said about feedback loops, internalizing behavior, all doesn't happen because the teacher can't even be there to do the job. At heart of their case is a central tension. They want teachers to do lots of things, but at the same time, they won't want teachers to teach the basic skills. In contrast, we always talk about defending the needs of healthcare and development as prerequisites, and we constantly push them for our answer. We didn't see a response, so on short-term survival, we took the debate. So let's talk about building aspirations. And side opposition essentially began with some stray points about how they don't need to set up lots of new projects if they keep it in primary schools, how they stop population expansion. But then they decided to drop these points in favor of a whole set of substitutes in their third speaker about multinational companies, about education dealing with corruption, and a whole list of examples. It's really unfortunate they came out so late in the debate because we couldn't address it. But in any case, the fact is they never showed teachers would be trained, so none of these outcomes would be able to be achieved. We already handled all these arguments. In fact, we pushed it further because my second speaker, Ashish's argument about governance, learning environments, and manpower all being inadequate in the developing world for universal primary education weren't dealt with. We even showed that even when corruption occurred, it was far less on our side. We showed education was best when economic development comes first. That was right at the top of the debate. So on the issue of sustainable long-term development as well, we took the debate. On both yardsticks, we began and we chose to care, we chose to be real.